Have a good day, everyone. This is the report of Miss Ampalayuhan and Mrs. Adviento. I am the first reporter. I am Mary Joy A. Ampalayuhan. So our topic is all about the operational definition of variables. Operational definition of variables. One of the most important concepts in research is the concept and research of variables. There are many kinds of variables and many research studies involve the examination of relationship between variables. Variables may be studied one at a time or in relation to other variables. So in this chapter, pag-aaralan natin about sa variables, classification, and pagkakaiba ng mga variables at ang kanilang mga examples. What is variable? Variable is a concept that stands for variation within a class of objects or persons. By Franklin and Wallin in 1996. A variable is a characteristic or property that can take different values or attributes. Variables are the basic elements which are measured in a study. They are observable and measurable. So, ang variable is importanteng pag-aralan kasi it helps to measure concept in a study. At upang maunawaan natin ang mga kahulugan ng ating research, kung paano o saan kinuha or ano yung nangyari sa isang experiment. Variable is in research simply refers to a person, place, things, or phenomenon you are trying to measure in some way. Example of variables are age, sex, marital status, income, location of business, revenue, type of work, number of meetings, degree of malnutrition, level of fertilizer, type of crop, and size of land. So, sa variable ay mahalagang pag-aralan natin upang malaman ang epekto ng variable sa iba pang variables. Kaya meron tayong types of variables. The types of variables can be classified as dependent, independent, intervening, and antecedent variables. Dependent variables. The dependent variables is the assumed effect of another variable. It is change that occurs in the study population when one or more factors are changed or when an intervention is introduced. Usually, dependent variable is the problem itself. The independent variables is the assumed cause of the problem. It is an assumed reason for any change or variation in a dependent variable. An independent variable is sometimes treated as antecedent variable or variables before. Likewise, an antecedent variable may be treated as an independent variable. So, sa dependent variables, the dependent is the manipulated variable in an experiment. Ito ay nagbabago dahil sa tested ng eksperimento. So, usually, dependent variables ay nagiging problem. The dependent variable is the dependent because it is thought to depend in some way on the variation of the independent variable. At dahil ito ay effect, maaari siyang magiging problem ng iyong studies. So, ang independent naman is the cause of the problem. So, sa independent variable, ito ay yung reason kaya nag-change yung dependent variable kasi 'di ba ang dependent is the effect. So, the independent ay ang cause, so dito nalulutas ang problem. Kagaya din siya ng antecedent variables ang independent. So, the example number 1, in the study on the relationship between exposure to mass media and smoking habits among young adults, the independent variable is smoking habits, while the independent variable is exposure to mass media. A person smoking is assumed to change or vary depending on his or her mere exposure or degree of smoking to print or broadcast media related to smoking. So, for example, yung title ng research mo is The Relationship Between Exposure to Mass Media and Smoking Habits Among Young Adults. So, ang exposure to mass media is the cause and the effect is smoking habit. So, ngayon, si dependent variable, pag-aaralan niya kung ano yung nakakaapekto sa taong naninigarilyo And then, sa independent variable naman is maghahanap siya ng dahilan para maiwasan o matigilan yung pagiging smoking habit ng isang tao. So, ang independent is exposure to mass media. So, ngayon, dahil ka exposure to mass media, pwedeng maiwasan ng isang taong ang paninigarilyo. And the example number 2, in the experimental study to test the effect of peer counseling on the student study habits, the independent variable is exposure to peer counseling. It is assumed that students who have better study habits than those who have been counseled by peers will have better study habits than those who were not counseled by peers or those who have been exposed to traditional counseling techniques. O halimbawa dito is the student counseled by peers ay nagkakaroon ng mas mahusay sa pag-aaral kaysa sa mga hindi nakaranas ng counsel by peers or sa mga social interaction. So, ang effect ng study habits is pag-aaral mo ngayon, sa pag-aaral mo ngayon, pwedeng mas better, di ba, na mag-study. So, ang dahilan nito is kailangan mo munang ma-expose through peer counseling upang mas ma-enhance mo yung pag-aaral mo. Example number 3, in the study entitled Factors that Influence of Extent of Participation in Household Decision-Making Among Married Professional. The dependent variable is extent of participation in household decision-making, while the independent variable is factors which include personal characteristics of the respondent such as age, sex, educational attainment, and income. So, sa independent variables or extent of decision-making participation, maaaring mahirapan tayo magdesisyon dahil sa ating pagkakaiba. And then sa independent variables naman is the factors, sex, educational, age, or income. So, ito yung mga nagiging dahilan minsan kaya hindi nagkakaunawaan dahil sa ating pagkakaiba ng pananaw or personal background. So, the intervening variables naman, it is factor that works between the independent and dependent variables. It can weaken or strengthen the effect of the independent on the dependent variables. It is also called a facilitating moderator or a control variables. So, ito ay tinatawag na mediator variable or facilitating variables. So, the intervening variables can help the researchers clarify the relationship between independent and dependent variables. The example number 1 nga is, in the study of knowledge of the dangers of smoking, attitudes towards life, and smoking habits of young professionals. The intervening variable is the attitude towards life. A person's attitude may increase or decrease the influence of knowledge on danger of smoking or the independent variables. On smoking habits is the dependent variables. So ngayon, upang maintindihan natin itong problem or itong study, sa intervening variables, kailangan niyang ipaliwanag kung ano yung nagiging attitude ng isang taong naninigarilyo o ano yung pagkakaiba niya towards life. Sa independent naman, ito yung dahilan kung bakit niya ginagawa yun. And then, as sa dependent is the smoking habits. Dito niya ngayon ma-realize kung ano yung naging apekto sa kanya dahil sa kanyang paninigarilyo. So, alam naman nating mapanganib ang paninigarilyo, but kahit alam natin ito is hindi pa rin nila maiwasan dahil na-addict na sila or mahirapan na silang alisin ito or ayaw nila itong pigilan kung hindi nila maisip na mamamatay na sila. So, hanggat buhay pa sila is ini-enjoy pa rin nila ito. Example number 2, in the study, factor that influence household decision-making participation of married professional, the intervening variable is the gender sensitivity may affect the relationship between selected factors. The independent variables and decision-making participation is the dependent variables. So, men are generally expected to participate in decision-making more than women because of social perception. prescription. Older, better educated individuals and those with big income are also expected to participate more actively in decision making than their younger, less educated counterparts. It may also be possible that women with a gender sensitive partner may also be actively involved in decision making despite poor education or low income. So, yung pagkakaiba natin ng gender is maaaring nakakaapekto ito sa ating relationship or ito ang dahilan minsan kaya hindi tayo nagkakaintindihan sa mga bagay-bagay. The example number 3, in the study on the effect of information education campaign or IEC on the land reform on the farmer's attitude towards land reform, the link of the farmer-landlord relationship is the intervening variable. It is assumed that this variable can strengthen or weaken the relationship between exposure to IEC materials or the independent variable, and the attitudes towards land reform is the dependent variables. So, ang problem dito is, maaring narinig ng isang magsasaka ang tungkol sa benefit of land, but tinanggihan pa rin ito dahil sa malapit na relationship ng kanyang landlord and for his family, and dahil ayaw niya maputol ang kanyang lupain. So, the last variable is the antecedent variable. An antecedent variable is a factor or characteristic which is found before the independent variable. It is expected to influence the independent variables. It is usually irreversible. So, ito ay katangian na makikita bago ang independent variables. Ito ay kadalasan nakaka-influence sa independent na minsan ay hindi mapawalang bisa. So, example number 1 of antecedent. In the study entitled Attitude Towards Land Reform and Acceptance of the Program Among Lowland Farmers of Northern Luzon, the major concern of the study is the influence of attitudes toward land reform, the independent variables, and the farmers' acceptance of the program is the independent variables. The farmers' attitude towards land reform is expected to vary according to their education, tenurial status, and size of the land they own, or the antecedent variables. So, ang dependent dito is ano yung maging epekto pag tinanggap nila yung program. At yung independent, ano-ano yung mga dapat na attitude na ipapakita nila towards land reform. Sa antecedent naman, kailangan niyang i-explain kung bakit naka-base sa education yung pagtanggap ng mga lupain. Example number 2, in the study entitled Extent of Exposure to Print, Media, and Reading Ability of College Freshmen. The main concern is the relationship between student, extent of exposure to print media, independent variables, and their reading ability or the independent variables. The student exposure to print media, however, may depend on their sex, residence, and their parents' education or the antecedent variables. So the main problem is the relationship between student at ang kanilang skills sa pagbabasa, but nakadepende ito sa kanilang tirahan, kasarian, at edukasyon ng kanilang parents. Ang antecedent ngayon is hahanapin niya kung ano-ano yung mga pagkakaiba nila estado sa buhay, at yung independent is ano yung mga skills na makukuha nila sa pagbabasa, and then the dependent naman ay ano yung epekto sa mga student kapag sila ay laging nagbabasa. So our next reporter is Mrs. Adviento.
I am next reporter. I am Erica E. Adviento, Bachelor in Human Services, a fourth-year student. So our topic is all about operational definition of variables. A variable must be operationally defined according to how it is used in the study so that it can be properly measured. The operational definition gives a specific meaning to the variable. A variable must be defined in terms used and measured in the study. A variable must be defined in terms of events, units of measurement that are observable by the senses. And these events, units of measurement, serve as indicators of variables. So, ano ba ang ibig sabihin ng variable in research? So, ipapaliwanag ko para mas So, variable, tumutukoy lamang sa isang tao, lugar, bagay o phenomenon sa sinusubukan mong sukatin sa ilang paraan. The best way to understand the difference between a dependent and independent variable is that the meaning of each is implied by what the words tell us about the variable you are using. Other words, ito ay tumutukoy ayon sa kung paano ito ginagamit sa pag-aaral upang ito ay maayos na masukat. At sinusukat sa pag-aaral, ito ay nagsisilbing isang tagapaghiwatig ng variable. Kung paano mo tutukuyin at susukatin ng isang partikular na variable habang ginagamit ito sa iyong pag-aaral. So, here's the example. Variables. The variables first is age. This refers to the length of time a person has lived since she was born. Ito ay tumutukoy sa haba ng panahon na nabubuhay ang isang tao mula nung siya ay sinilang. The second is educational attainment. This refers to the highest grade year completed by a respondent. So ito yon, tumutukoy sa pinakamataas na taon na baitang na matapos ng respondent. Third, exposure to smoking information campaign. So ito yon, nangungulugan kung naririnig o nabasa o hindi ng respondent ang tungkol sa kampanya laban sa paninigarilyo at dami ng beses niyang narinig o nabasa ang mensahe. The fourth, knowledge about smoking. So this is represented by the total number of correct answer in a 10-item questionnaire on smoking. The next is, so bibigay muna ako ng another examples dito sa operational definition of variables. Example, if we are concerned with the effect of media violence on aggression, then we need to be very clear what we mean by the different terms. Kailangan nating maging napakalinaw kung ano ang ibig sabihin ng iba't ibang termino. Next, establishing categories of variables to facilitate description and analysis of data. Categories of variables can be established. Ito ay establishing categories of variables. Ito ay upang mapadali ang paglalarawan at pagsusuri ng data. Ang bawat kategorya ay dapat ding tukuyin sa pagtatakbo. So, the researchers also organize variables into a variety of categories. So, the most common, which include like independent variables, dependent variables, qualitative variables, and qualitative variables, so on. Next, mutually exclusive categories. Categories are mutually exclusive when a respondent cannot be assigned to more than one category. Some variables like knowledge scores can be grouped and each group assigned to a category such as high level of knowledge, average level of knowledge, and low level of knowledge. So it is when objects can be placed into a category and no other. So here's the example. Number 1, for yung sa mutually exclusive categories, ito din ay mga kaganapan na mga bagay na hindi maaaring mangyari sa parehong oras. Yon. Example number 1. If, for instance, the operational definition of level of knowledge about cancer is the number of questions about cancer, which assign a range of scores, assuming that the total possible score is 20. The possible categories could be high level of knowledge, was scores of 14 to 20. Then, the average level of knowledge, scores of 7 to 13. Last is low level of knowledge, scores of 0 to 6. Number 2. Example number 2 for variables like residence. Ito ay tungkol sa mga paninirahan. Kung ang kahulugan ng pagpapatakbo nito ay mga katangiang geographical ng lugar kung saan permanenteng naninirahan ang mga respondent. So, categorized as rural and urban. So, the rural, ito ay ang isang lungsod o isang sentro ng bayan. It refers to place resident which is located outside the geographical jurisdiction of a city or town center. And the urban is, ito ay matatagpuan sa loob ng city proper o sa loob ng town proper ng isang munisipalidad. And then, another example dito sa mutually exclusive categories is hindi ka maaaring tumakbo ng pataas at pasulong ng sabay ang mga kaganapang like running forward at running backwards ito ay kapwa eksklusibo. Ang paghagis ng barya ay maaari ding magbigay sa iyo ng ganitong uri ng kaganapan. So yun ang another example. So dito tayo sa exhaustive categories. So categories are exhaustive if all the possible responses are included among the options of responses. Example, para sa mga sagot sa isang tanong tungkol sa relihiyon ay hindi nauubos dahil ang isang tanong tungkol sa relihiyon ay dahil ang isang Mormon ay hindi maaaring uriin sa ilalim ng alinman mga kategorya sa listahan. A list of categories like Protestant, Catholic, Muslim, and Buddhist. So, for instance, the variables hobbies. Tinutukoy ito sa isang aktibidad na sinasagawa ng mga tao sa oras ng paglilibang o libreng oras. The possible categories of this variable may be singing, reading, painting, writing poems, sewing, others specify. The next is operational definition of key terms. What is the operational definition of key terms? There may be terms in the study, not variables. Depende sa mga sitwasyon o pangyayari that have meanings different from their dictionary meaning, or they take on different meanings depending on situation or events. So these terms must also be defined operationally to avoid misinterpretation. So yun, ang mga termino ito ay dapat nating tukuyin sa pagtatakbo upang maiwasan ang maling interpretasyon. Ito ay depende sa kung paano ginagamit at sinusukat ang salita. So here's the examples of operational definition of key terms. The first is family planning user. Is any currently married woman age 15 to 49 years old or a married man age 15 or older who has used a method to prevent or space or pregnancy at least during the last 3 months. Second, coastal barangay is a village or community which is located near the sea where fishing is the main activity of the residents. Merging is the absorption of one or more business firms by another existing firm, which remains its identify and takes over. And lastly, how to make operational definitions. First, list your independent, dependent, and interviewing, if any, variables. Second, write an operational definition for each variable. The third, identify the possible categories of each variable and determine in the categories can be clearly understood, are mutually exclusive, do not overlap, and exhaustive. So, ang listahan ng mga kategorya ay dapat kumpleto upang ang lahat ng mga respondent ay maaaring ikategorya. So, fourth, list the key terms which may be interpreted differently by different people unless they are operationally defined. Write an operational definition for each term. Last, when defining a variable or a term, be guided by the following questions. First is, does the definition clearly specify the way the variable will be measured? Are the categories of each variable mutually exclusive? Are the categories exhaustive? So, yeah, that's all. Thank you.